So in this video today, I'm going to focus on how to get the best, most cinematic footage from the GoPro Hero 11. Now I've done some videos that show the best settings with this camera for no edit footage, and those are already out there. I've linked to that above. But today's video is for those of you that would like to dig a little bit deeper and would like to film footage with the Hero 11 that you're going to plan on editing later. Now, if you haven't edited GoPro footage before or edited any video, no worries on that. I do have a follow-up video that I'm working on for this one, where I'm going to show you step-by-step how to edit a complete GoPro video. And in that video, I'm going to guide you step-by-step through the process of editing a GoPro video in DaVinci Resolve, the free version. So the way I'm going to structure today's video is the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what I call the core cinematic settings that you need to configure on your Hero 11 in order to get that best possible cinematic footage. And then the next section of the video, I'm going to provide you some tips for filming the most cinematic footage. And finally, the third section, I'm going to talk about some tools that will help you get the best possible cinematic footage. So let's dive into those core settings that you'll need to plug into your GoPro in order to get the best possible, most cinematic footage. So first thing we want to do is we want to go into the video mode here, and you can click down here at the bottom. You can pick any of these that you want to. For the sake of this, I'm going to pick the standard one at the top. Navigate in there. And so for the resolution in frames per second, what I recommend here is I recommend setting it to either 5.3K or 4K. So 5.3K, if you have a newer computer that has fairly good specs on it, I recommend doing that because you could downscale it to 4K when you're editing and you're gonna have extra detail in your footage there. But if you have a little bit older computer or maybe one that's not higher end, then I recommend you select 4K. Now for the frames per second, I recommend keeping it set to 60. And the reason for that is this is going to give you the most flexibility later on when you're editing your footage. Because if you drop that 60 frames per second footage onto a 24 frames per second timeline, it's going to give you a lot of slow motion flexibility. You could slow it down to 40% of its original speed on a 24 frames per second timeline. And of course, if you're not in the United States, then you would select 50 here, and that would be on a 25 frames per second timeline. And as far as the aspect ratio up here at the top, I do recommend sticking with 16:9. If you do 4:3 for the aspect ratio, that does give you even more flexibility to have motion in your footage later on, especially vertically. But in 4:3, you can only go up to 5.3K 30. Now, if you go with 4K, you can do 4K 60. So you could do 4:3 if you want that extra flexibility later on to have motion in your scenes where maybe you're not gonna have the motion when you're filming, but you wanna add it later on, you could do 4:3. I generally do 16:9 because I like having that 5.3K 60. So one of the biggest key settings here that we need for cinematic footage is you want to set your lens to linear, because linear is going to give that footage that does not have distortion in it. It's going to have straight lines, it's not going to have fisheye, and that's really going to help you get a nice cinematic look from this GoPro camera. For hyper smooth, you want to have that on unless you're using a couple of the tools that I mentioned later on. And when I talk about those tools, I will tell you what settings you need to change here. But for your core setting here, you want to take advantage of that gimbal-like stabilization that comes from the Hero 11 by having Hypersmooth on. For cinematic footage, I don't recommend having Hypersmooth set to boost or auto boost. I do recommend just having it on. That's going to give adequate stabilization in nearly all use cases. So the rest of these settings here at the top do not apply to cinematic footage. But in the Pro Tune section, there's going to be several that are key. The first one here that I really want to emphasize is 10-bit. You want to make sure 10-bit is set to on. 10-bit is going to give you a lot more dynamic range that you can really bring out later on when you're editing. Your footage is going to have 1 billion color shades available to you, versus if you do 8-bit, it's only 16 million. And having that 10-bit footage is kind of a key to cinematic looking footage. It's going to make it look a lot better when you're editing later on. Another important one here is bitrate. You want to make sure that's set to high. That's going to be really important for the detail in your footage, and it's going to help your footage look a lot more cinematic. For the shutter, you can keep this set to auto. There's going to be one use case where you would need to change a shutter, and that's going to be if you're using ND filters. But I will talk about that later on as well when I go over those. For the EV comp, I generally recommend keeping this to negative 0.5. And the reason for that is the GoPro tends to overexpose the footage a little, and it's helpful to have that EV comp set there so that it doesn't blow out your highlights, especially with clouds or if you're out on a bright sunny day. It's really important to have that there. You can always bring up the exposure a little bit later on, but having that EV comp set to negative 0.5 helps preserve a lot of those details. The white balance you want to set to a static value. In general, for normal daytime filming outside, you want to make this either 5000 or 5500K. 5500K is going to be slightly warmer. So if you don't want it slightly warmer, then you can do 5000K. If you want it just a little bit warmer, you can do 5500K. And then if you're filming during that golden hour at the beginning of the day or the end of the day, I recommend bringing this up to 6500K. It's going to really help you capture some of those neat colors that are available around sunrise or sunset. For the ISO minimum, make sure that's set to 100. And for the ISO maximum, make sure that's set to 800. For the sharpness, you want to have this set to low. When you're editing later on, you can always bring out some sharpness detail in the footage, but you don't want to have too much sharpness baked into your footage because it is very difficult to make the footage softer without losing a lot of important detail. For the color, you want to make sure this is set to flat. Flat is going to give you that color profile that resembles log, and it's going to give you a lot more flexibility to really color grade and edit that footage later on to give it that look that you want it to have. So you want to film in flat. Now, when it comes to audio here, we're going to talk about this later on as well. If you're going to be filming where you want your audio from the GoPro, you're going to want to at very least use the media mod, and more than likely, you're going to want to use some type of external mic, probably a wireless mic or a shotgun mic that you can mount on top of the media mod. There are a lot of options for that, and they don't have to cost very much. There are some good options out there in the $50 to $100 range, but if you want to have a cinematic video that includes audio from this camera, you're going to want to make sure you have good audio. So these settings down here for the raw audio and the wind, I usually leave those alone for off and auto. Off for raw audio and auto for wind, because I'm not going to use the audio straight out of the camera anyway. And then these settings down here at the bottom will not apply. So now that we've discussed the core best settings that you need to set up on your Hero 11, I want to provide you with some tips that are going to help you get the very best footage from your camera. And these tips are pretty simple to follow. So one of the first tips that I have is keep in mind where the sun is when you're filming. So what I mean by that is when you're filming, you don't want to be facing the sun with your GoPro. The footage is not going to look good. It's going to look best when the sun is behind you at your back. So whatever your subject is that you're filming, you want the sun behind you looking at that subject. And of course, generally it's a good idea to be careful not to get your shadow in the footage unless your shadow is part of the story. Which, hey, it might be part of your story to have your shadow in there. If it is, make sure you get your shadow. But otherwise, you want to have the sun behind you for the very best footage. It's going to light your footage nicely, and your footage is going to look extra good. Now, if the sun isn't directly behind you, you also can go to about 45 degrees behind you on your subject, and it can still look good. So 45 degrees is going to generally be over one of your shoulders, kind of at an angle from your back. And if the sun is in that placement, it's going to look good on your subject as well, especially if it's lighting one part of your subject's face and the other one is a little darker. That's going to look a little bit more cinematic as well when you do so. Tip number 2 is keep in mind the GoPro has a static minimum focal distance. In other words, you need to have your GoPro back a certain distance from your subject, otherwise your subject is going to be blurry and not in focus. In the case of the GoPro, that minimum focal distance is about 12 inches, so about a foot. But as a general rule, I like to keep my GoPro at least 18 inches back from whatever my subject is in order to ensure that it's not out of focus. And tip number 3, which is a general good practice for whatever you're filming, is plan at least some of your shots ahead of time. And this takes a little bit of thought and planning, but it's a good idea to write down and storyboard out what shots you would like to get ahead of time. If you go into your project with some idea of what you're going to film, it's going to help you keep that in mind when you're filming, and you're going to tend to get a lot better footage to tell your story. If you just go out there and run and gun, you could get some pretty cool shots, but they might not necessarily be cohesive, and they might not fit together with whatever story you're trying to tell. That's going to help you focus on the overall story you're telling with your project, and it's going to come out a lot better if you do plan out a few shots ahead of time. Next, I want to talk about those basic tools that I recommend having when you're filming cinematic footage with your GoPro. So when filming with your GoPro, you're going to want to have some type of tripod or grip or selfie stick, as it's going to make it a lot easier to film with your GoPro versus holding it like this or this and moving it around. I have filmed that way before and I've made it work, but I have to say it is a lot easier when you have the GoPro mounted on something where you can hold on to that and not the actual camera. Because if you're holding onto the actual camera, you could accidentally bump the screen, you could accidentally get your fingers in front of the lens. There's a lot of things that can go wrong while holding onto it. So you could use anything from the Shorty here. GoPro makes this. This extends about 6 to 8 inches here. Or you could do the El Grande on the larger end of the scale. And this one extends a very long distance. So what I like about this is this allows for a lot of creativity. You can have your GoPro way out here and you can be talking to it. You can be filming from a higher angle. You can do a lot of stuff with it. And it nicely extends outward and inward. It's really easy to work with. You can loosen it here and change the angle. And it's got this mount right here built onto it. So my favorite personally is the El Grande, just because of that flexibility where you can extend it several feet out. But if you don't initially see yourself having a use for that, then Shorty is a great choice, or the Volta is a great choice as well. Now the advantage with the Volta here is you can fold this out like a tripod, so you can get your static shots with it. And the other advantage is the built-in battery in the Volta. It equals about 4 of the GoPro batteries. So instead of having to bring along a bunch of these batteries and a charger, if you have a fully charged Volta, you can just hook on the GoPro and you can plug it in here. And it's going to keep your GoPro powered for several hours of filming. So personally, I like the Volta, but the Volta does not have an extendability. So basically, if you have your Shorty fully extended next to your Volta, the Shorty technically extends further out than the Volta does. But the Volta is definitely a lot less extension than if you have the El Grande. The El Grande extends much further. Little comparison here. So it really depends on what your filming needs are, but I like the Volta for filming situations where I don't need the extendability of this. And it's also worth noting that El Grande does not have tripod legs that fold out on it like Shorty and the Volta do. So with El Grande, you would have to mount El Grande on something like an actual tripod using a connector down here at the bottom, because there is no tripod feature on El Grande. The other thing you're obviously going to want to have is you're going to want to have a good micro SD card that provides plenty of space. So personally, I like the SanDisk Extreme cards, and I use a 512 gigabyte one in my Hero 11, and that has hours and hours of filming potential before it would fill up. I like having that flexibility so I don't feel like I have to be limited with my filming. I like having plenty of space, but at minimum, if you're going to be filming a lot of that high quality 5.3K or 4K cinematic footage, I recommend having at least a 128 gigabyte micro SD card. And I do personally recommend the SanDisk Extreme cards. I found that those do work best on the GoPro. There are a couple other options that GoPro says should be compatible with this camera, but the SanDisk Extreme I found have given me the best results, and they've been able to keep up even when I'm doing 5.3K 60 or 4K 120. And finally, if you're going to be filming talking or other key audio with this, you want to make sure you have good audio quality, because you could have the best looking footage in the world, but if people cannot hear what you're trying to say, or if the audio sounds really bad, it's going to probably ruin your cinematic project. So my recommendation, if you want good audio, is have the media mod here and at least use the external mic on the media mod. That does a lot better with audio than the built-in mics on here. And if you want to take it a little bit further, then I recommend something like the DJI wireless mics here. With these, you can hook these into the media mod on the back here, and then you can mount the receiver here. And there is a lot you can do with the DJI wireless mic kit. It is a little bit pricey at around $300. So my advice is if you're going to be talking a lot and you want really good sound quality, I recommend the DJI wireless mic. It's a great option. I have also used some of the Rode Wireless Go's, and those also work well. And those are a little bit lesser price than the wireless mic. And finally, let's talk about some advanced tools that'll help you get some extra cinematic footage. Now, I've done videos on both of these tools, so I'm not going to go through all of the details in this video. I will link to each of them above as I talk about them. But the first tool that I recommend for getting some really cinematic footage are these ND filters right here from Freewell. So there are a couple different brands that make ND filters, but what I like about Freewell is I consider these the best value. They're a good price for a good product. I've used these a lot, and they're great because the ND filters help you get that cinematic motion blur. Now in the video above, I do explain how to get that, and I explain the settings to put in your camera, and I explain how to know which ND filter to use, and then I provide a lot of samples. So I definitely encourage you to check that out if you would like to use these. But the key setting you have to change when using the ND filters, there's two settings. The first one, if you're filming in 24 frames per second, you want to set the shutter speed to 1/48. And if you're filming in 30 frames per second, you want to put the shutter speed to 1/60. And if you're filming in 60 frames per second, you want to do a shutter speed of 1/120. It's called the 180-degree rule, and you want to have your shutter speed set to twice the frame rate whenever you're using the ND filters. That's going to make sure you get that cinematic motion blur. The camera I'm talking to right now has a shutter speed at twice the frame rate. So when I move something, you can see that nice motion blur, and it looks really good. And the second setting you have to change when using these is you do have to have Hypersmooth turned off. If you don't have Hypersmooth turned off, your footage is going to look really bad and it's not going to be usable. And that's because Hypersmooth needs those clearer, sharper frames that are given by having a higher shutter speed. And if your shutter speed is set to lower, especially 1/48, your footage is going to look really bad and it's going to be unusable. So of course, if you turn off Hypersmooth, your footage is also going to be unusable because it's not going to be stabilized unless you're stationary. That's where we need a gimbal as a tool to use along with these. So the two gimbals that I recommend for the Hero 11 are the Inky Falcon Plus and the Hohem iSteady 4. Both of these are great gimbals. I've tested them and used them extensively. The key difference, and you might be able to tell by the photo, is the Inky Falcon Plus supports the GoPro being in the media mod. You can use this with the GoPro on the Inky Falcon Plus. But for the Hohem iSteady Pro 4, you cannot use the media mod. It won't fit on here with the GoPro. You can only fit the GoPro on here, but you can't fit the media mod. So that's where the defining factor is. Do you want to use the media mod for your project, or are you going to capture audio in a different way? If you don't need the media mod, I recommend the Hohem iSteady Pro 4. This gimbal is a little bit cheaper than the Inky Falcon Plus, and it is easier to attach the GoPro and balance it on this gimbal. There's a simple clip that you lift up, you put the GoPro on, you put it back down. I do have a video for both of these, and I've linked to those above. I encourage you to check that out when you're considering which one to get. But my overall favorite is the Hohem iSteady Pro 4. It's a lesser price, it stabilizes well, and it's just all around easier to use. But if I have to have the media mod, then I'm going to use my Inky Falcon Plus. And finally, the other more advanced tool that you can use to get super cinematic footage using your GoPro is this anamorphic lens from Skyreet. I recently released a video on this, and I've linked to that above. But basically, this anamorphic lens is going to take your linear footage and it's going to make it look extra wide, but it's still going to allow you to preserve the linear aspects of that footage. But the few things you need to know with this lens is you have to have the lens set to linear on your GoPro, and you have to have hyper smooth off. Otherwise, this footage is not going to look proper when you film it. In addition, when you're editing, you have to do something called de-squeeze the footage, because otherwise the footage is going to be stretched vertically. So everybody is going to look extra tall in that footage. So what you do is you de-squeeze it for the proper vertical aspect ratio there. And when you de-squeeze it on a 16:9 timeline, you're going to have the horizontal bars. There's going to be the bar at the top and the bar at the bottom. You don't have to keep those bars there. You can of course zoom in and get rid of the bars, but it's not going to have the same width of field, but that is an option if you want to use this lens to put some of this footage into another project where you don't use the lens on your GoPro and you just use the default lens. And the neat thing about this anamorphic lens is the footage does look a little bit different with this than from the GoPro. I think the footage looks extra cinematic with this. The pixel shape looks a little bit different and I really like how it comes out, especially when filming in the winter with snow. I love the effect of this lens. So like I said, I've linked to that video above so you can check it out with the anamorphic lens as well. But my recommendation is if you're using the ND filters or the anamorphic lens, you want to have a gimbal to go with it. Otherwise, your footage is not going to come out well unless your camera is stationary. So now that I've talked about all of these best settings for getting the best, most cinematic footage from your GoPro Hero 11, I am going to be releasing a video that is going to go in depth, and I'm going to show you a complete guide to editing a GoPro video project in DaVinci Resolve, the free version. Because knowing how to edit this footage is just as important as knowing how to capture it. So that is going to be a part 2 follow-up to this video. If you don't yet see it linked to above, it means I haven't published a video yet, but that video will be coming out in the very near future, and I'm super excited to share it with you. And if you haven't video edited before, or you haven't used DaVinci Resolve before, it can be a little bit intimidating the first time. So I'm going to make sure I explain each and every step that I take so that you can follow along and learn. So until we talk again, happy GoProing.